Welcome back. In this video we're going to look at scope. So we already have a bit of a code here and we have a formula. So here we've got some mathematics. We've got g of x and b is 4x minus 8b. And then we've got f of x and b, which is either of these two equations depending on the result of g, x and b. So if g of x and b is greater than 0, then we use this formula here. Else, if g, x and b are less than or equal to 0, then we use this formula here. Now, this basically is an if. So if that's greater than, we use this, else we use this. And we can see that right here in the code. Okay? Now we've got the user entering x and b, so x and b, they enter x, they enter b. We calculate g of x and b here, okay, 4 times x minus 8 times b. Then we check if g of x and b is greater than 0. If it is, we use that first formula, else we use the other formula. We also have this question to the user, do you want to calculate again? We get the input, and if they enter anything other than n, then we do it again and again and again. So with this, what we're going to use this example for is a discussion on where the variables are declared, which we haven't really worried about so far. But where the variables declared changes where they can use these variables, and also changes the readability of the document. So you'll notice right from the start we have these braces throughout our program, okay? And each brace has a matching closing brace. Okay, so we've got an opening and closing. So these are all working in pairs. Okay, so we've got 4 lots of them in this program. Now, when we declare a variable within any of these braces, we refer to this as its scope, meaning the variable will exist, meaning be accessible, so you can use that identifier, from the point it was created to the end of its scope. Okay? So the further out to the variable is declared, so for example, if it's declared in main, so this red scope here, okay, then it's available everywhere in main after we create it. So you can see that this input is created in this outer scope here, and so we create it here, and that means we can use it all the way down to here. If there was another line before it, okay, so if we had another line before it, then even though before it is within the same scope, we can't use it until we declare it, but because it's declared in that scope, we can use it all the way to the end. So if you look inside the do-while loop, where we've got this blue scope, okay, so we've got from here down to here, we've got this x and b, so x is allowed to be used all the way up to here, and b is allowed to be used all the way up to here as well. Okay, noticing the b, even though it's within the scope, it can only be used after it's declared, but right to the end of its scope. Now, if we try to declare input within the do-while loop scope, okay, so if we move this input here into here, it wouldn't work because input wouldn't exist after this brace, and we need it after the brace to evaluate the while. So it has to be outside. We don't use x and b outside of these braces, so it's perfectly fine to have them just declared within this scope. So this is called local scope. Okay, so it's declared locally within this scope. Now, a good way to represent this is with some boxes. And we're going to keep this simple right now. We'll look at some more formal ways of drawing this when we get to pointers. So we'll improve upon how we draw this diagram later. And I should have done that. Here's the colors we're using. So to match the colors we're using, I'm going to draw a red box here. Okay, and that's going to be the scope of main. So within the scope of main, when we're up to this point in the program, we have input. Okay, and I might actually do that in black. Okay, and then inside of that, so once we've reached, say, this point in the program, we have another bit of scope, which is our do while. And inside of that, we have x, we have b, and if we reach all the way down here, we'd have g of xb, and we'd also have f of x. Okay, so they're within that scope. Keeping in mind that, for example, f of x only exists from the point that it's declared, so after that point. Now, a common mistake that a lot of students will make is they will declare stuff within the if statements. So, for example, taking this f of x out and putting the int here. So declaring it here by writing int, and declaring it here by writing int. Now, if we do that, the problem is that it's only available up to this point here. Okay, so it exists and then it's gone after that point, so it's not accessible. And same with this one. So we'd never be able to get it here, and we'd actually get a error. Okay, so let's change that back. Now, basically, a lot of students, especially early on, will feel a little bit uncomfortable about this, and so what they'll do is declare everything at the top of main. Okay, so this will work, but it's actually making things harder for yourself when you get to large programs. So we want to try and limit scope where appropriate. Obviously, if a variable is used throughout the entirety of the program, then it makes sense to declare it at the top of main. But if it's only used within a small amount of scope, then we declare it within that scope, because that avoids us having to deal with a huge number of variables and having to debug them. Rather, we can just focus on this little area of our program and just look at x and b within that, and we don't have to worry about x and b outside of that. So this also helps readability, okay? Because we can see for a reader that x and b is going to only be used in here, and I don't have to go look through a big program to find where else x and b is used. Okay, so it helps it with readability and for your own readability too. It's also good to try and declare the variable just before it's used. Obviously, if it's used in a lot of places, then you can just declare it at the top of the scope. But if it's only going to be used in a limited space, just declare it above so you can see that, okay, this wasn't initialized and now it's going to be used straight away. So it makes it easier for you to debug because you don't have to worry about f of x before that point. Now, one other thing that we've got here, which is a little new, is we've got this int w up the top. Now, this is outside of any braces here, and this is called global scope. So this means that we can use w anywhere. Okay, so we could use it here, we could use it in here, we could use it here, we could use it here. So we can use it anywhere. Now, whilst this sounds helpful, and it can be in certain situations, this can make it really, really hard to debug your code if you have quite a few global variables, because you don't know where it changes, and so it can be hard to find where it changes. So in this subject, we're going to avoid them pretty much completely unless we tell you to use them, okay? And there are deductions in marks if you do use them unnecessarily, okay? So try and avoid using globals. We'll tell you when you need globals. All right, that's it. Thank you.